Excellencies, dear colleagues and partners, 600 million people in Africa have no access to electricity. Therefore, we need to build our new energy system on green energy sources. My government has decided to scale up our climate finance massively to at least $500 million annually by 2023. Our support to Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa is a good example. In Uganda, our joint target is to connect almost 3 million people with basic electricity by 2025. And this is with renewable energy sources. The new technology allows us to connect millions of people faster, cheaper, and more sustainable. It's a win-win situation where we can achieve universal access to energy for millions and still be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Yet, affordable electricity is still a challenge in many countries. Therefore, Denmark will provide development financing to support a just and inclusive green transition. We cannot leave anyone behind. Denmark has more than 40 years of experience with a just and green transition. Our transition has shown that green energy can be a driver for both jobs and growth. More jobs will be created than lost. We need to identify where jobs will be created, how many, and what skills will be needed. It's a unique opportunity. Create green jobs for future generations. That is why I'm so pleased to open this side event focusing on job creation and skills development in the renewable energy sector in Africa. I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for those of you that can join us here this afternoon. I'd like to open this discussion. We're going to keep it very informal. I'm very pleased to be joined by a couple of very experienced practitioners in the field. But I'll just say take a few minutes maybe just to put out the context of what we're trying to achieve. Now, the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa is a relatively new instrument. We've been going now a couple of years. What we're trying to do is encourage companies and businesses to take forward energy access initiatives in 5 African countries at the moment, looking to expand that as we go ahead, but also to look at other opportunities for enhancing some of the benefits that go with that. And of course, when we look at the current situation in Africa, particularly in the post-COVID period, we've seen that the off-grid energy sector and Africa in general, of course, has been hit pretty hard. And we've seen that a number of the companies acting in this area have struggled, with getting their equipment out there, getting paid, and so forth. And of course, the beneficiaries, the consumers, they of course have suffered because they're not able to get their products to market. Many of them are in rural areas and so forth. So we've seen a very challenging marketplace, but we also recognize that for the off-grid space to really grow, we need the right skills. We need the right type of skills in this area. And we're very pleased. I'm very pleased to have our colleagues here who can talk about some of their experiences in this area. Off-grid energy is very much still an untapped opportunity for creating jobs, particularly for youth. And we've seen that, particularly in Africa, which is a very young continent, that there are a lot of people out there looking for work, looking for developing their own skill set and so forth. And we're seeing that the off-grid sector, both solar home systems, mini-grids and related sectors, are emerging as a significant employer, potentially, in economies that suffer from pretty high and persistent rates of joblessness. We're seeing that supporting the development of the off-grid energy sector can therefore have a wide and positive effect on job creation as I say, particularly in the post-pandemic environment that we're in. We're seeing that these countries can benefit from mitigating both climate change but also accelerating the green transition. And we heard the Minister talk about a just and inclusive transition going forwards. So the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa, just to say a few words more, is really it's a multi-donor program. We're very pleased to have been supported by the governments of Sweden and Denmark and Germany also. We also benefit from support from the Power Africa program, which is administered by USAID, which is contributing as an in-kind contributor. The program seeks to bring clean and affordable energy access to underserved people in rural areas. So we have very much a rural focus. And our target is to bring said electricity to 6 million beneficiaries. We've seen this working rather well in Zambia already, and we're around the 1 million beneficiaries target at the moment. We're very fortunate to have had, particularly in regard of the Uganda window, of having a specific window for contributing to employment and job creation. Now, to this end, we've commissioned Oxford Policy Management, represented here by Simon Trace. Very pleased to have you here, Simon. Simon, we asked you to undertake a study to look at the opportunities for both job creation, but also skills development. You know, what are the sort of needs for companies going forwards? So maybe if you could just take us through the work that you did for us. We're very pleased with that. We're very happy that you've been able to contribute to that, and that study is available. We have it on our website. But if you could perhaps take us through some of the lessons learned from that, and then Christina, will move to you later on as well. So.
Sure, Ash. Thanks very much for that. I mean, as Ash says, I'll talk about the study. I mean, we did look at two things really: the potential for off-grid electricity to provide jobs in Uganda up until about 2030, and also the sort of training and skills development needs in the off-grid sector in Uganda. I think I'm going to focus largely on the first bit in this conversation, but then I think as we develop a bit further, we'll probably touch on the second as well. Just for context, currently I think it's 38% of Uganda's population has access to electricity, and that's roughly split 50-50. So about 50% of that gets electricity from off-grid sources, mostly from either solar lanterns or solar home systems, and almost all of the other 50% gets it from grid. As of the figures as of sort of 2019, I think there was about 4,000 people that get electricity from mini grids. There is quite a lot of activity in that area, and that may have increased recently, but it's still a relatively small proportion of the total amount. But we're talking about something like 400,000 solar home systems or solar lanterns in circulation in Uganda so far to date. So it's a substantial amount. You know, off-grid as a potential employer is particularly important, as Ash was kind of implying, in a country like Uganda, where you've got a very youthful population looking for meaningful and good work. And further, by its nature, off-grid electricity supply has the potential to create jobs in rural areas, which is where the greatest demand is. So there's a real sort of potential here. I looked at from another perspective. Without these jobs, Uganda will not hit its targets for national electrification. It needs these people in order to put this equipment into people's hands. So this study was carried out between November 2020 and February 2021. We did four things really. First of all, we carried out a literature review which looked at off-grid references around off-grid electricity and job creation, mostly across sub-Saharan Africa, to try and look at experience there. And also homed in a little bit on a range of studies that tried to estimate job factors, so the sort of multiplier effect of how many people you need to deliver, for example, 10,000 solar home systems or to build a mini-grid. We also did some analysis of the predicted growth of the off-grid sector in Uganda, and then made some sort of estimates of employment potential, bringing those two things together. And then to sort of understand the existing structure of the off-grid sector, the size of the workforce, the skills and the sort of training demands, we did a set of interviews with, I think it was 34 representatives from across private sector, government, civil society, training institutions, and NGOs. And the companies we interviewed ranged in sort of size from about a turnover of $20,000 a year to a turnover of about $6 million a year. So it's quite a spread. And then finally, based on that, the information from the interviews, we put some, and the sort of calculation of growth of employment, we put some recommendations to NEFCO for the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa program in Uganda. Before going any further, just say something about the sort of types of jobs, or at least the sort of categories of jobs that are associated with electricity in general and off-grid in particular. So there's sort of 4 categories, if you like. There's direct jobs, and these are created by the sort of companies or entities that are actually providing the electricity services. It could be building mini-grids, it could be installing solar home systems, or it could be people that are involved in the sort of back sides of those organizations, accounting functions, IT functions, management functions, and the like. And that category breaks into 2, which is quite important. We'll come back to that again. There's a formal and an informal element of that. The other 3 categories, there's an indirect category of jobs, and these are people that are in the sort of upstream or downstream of that sector. So upstream, it could be people that are manufacturing inverters, for example, or the software for pay-as-you-go companies. Downstream, it's perhaps appliance manufacturers, people that are going to buy appliances to use electricity once they get it. We've then got productive use jobs, so this is where people use electricity for productive purposes once they get it. So it might be people that are employed in a flour mill, an electric flour mill that's been established because power is available, for example. And then you have induced jobs, and these are sort of perhaps the most difficult to put your fingers on, but these are forward linkages. So it's the people who are earning money either through productive use of electricity or through working in the electricity sector. They spend that money on goods and services, and in doing that they create jobs in other sectors as well. Those are known as the induced jobs. Now it gets more and more difficult to actually estimate numbers the further away you go from direct to indirect to productive use to induced. And what I'm really talking about today is direct, at least in this part of the discussion. So in terms of what sort of jobs we're talking about in the solar home system value chain, it could be procurement or even local assembly of solar home systems. It could be distribution, retail of those systems. It could be customer service, technical support, repairs, payment collection, and then ultimately probably e-waste and waste recycling. Should note that with solar home systems, there are 2 types of ways in which solar home systems are sold. They're either sold for cash or credit through what's known as pay-as-you-go systems. And the pay-as-you-go systems tend to employ a lot more people than the cash sales systems, and that's largely because they have a long-term relationship with the customer to manage the credit systems. So there's a longer-term employment there. And just to sort of finish on that, on the mini-grid side, the sort of value chain jobs there could be feasibility studies, technical designs of systems, procurement of equipment, transport logistics, customer service, technical maintenance, and operation and bill collection of systems. Just a few sort of caveats on job estimates. In the literature, there are widely different estimates from different sources and different countries of the number of employees required to sell or install 10,000 solar home systems or to build a mini-grid. And they can sometimes differ by an order of magnitude, so it's actually quite difficult to pin this down. And it's also very difficult in Uganda to get hold of enough information to be able to estimate that from first principles. In the end, we relied on some average figures from East Africa, actually from Christina's organisation Power for All's survey on powering jobs, which we felt were in the sort of middle of the range, but also had the best sort of supporting analysis to justify the figures in the first place. So how do we sort of then go about calculating job potential in Uganda from the off-grid sector? Well, we started by trying to understand national plans for access. And again, that's in itself not that easy. There are several national plans that produce several different sorts of targets. So you've got the Uganda Electricity and Connections Policy, the Uganda Vision 2040, Uganda Rural Electrification Strategy and Plan, and then you've got things like the UNSC for All plans. They all provide for different levels of coverage to be achieved at different times. Likewise, within those projections, there are different projections for the amount of that coverage, which will be grid versus off-grid, and then within the grid, between mini-grids and solar home systems. So there's a wide range there. So what we did there was to sort of discard some of the outliers and then use these different scenarios to try and create a sort of upper band and lower bound range of what was likely between now and 2030. And for solar home systems, that gave us a sort of an upper bound range of maybe something like 500,000 systems being installed a year, and a lower bound range of about 300,000. And then for mini grids, it was about an upper bound range of 109, 110 systems a year, at a lower bound range of 32 systems a year. So that gave us our sort of ranges of employment leads, if you like, in the sector. And so using those figures and using some of the sort of job factor figures we located from Christina's study, amongst others, we worked out what the annual volume of work was going to be, and therefore what the workforce was needed to deliver it. And we come to a workforce of somewhere between 9,000 and 16,500 people between now and 2030 needed to deliver those targets. And that sort of breaks down to 5,500 to 9,000 involved in the solar home systems, only about 600 to 2,000 involved in mini-grid construction, but then quite a lot more, about 3 to 5,500 involved in mini-grid operation and maintenance. So, I mean, how significant is that workforce? I mean, there's a workforce requirement of 9,000 to 16,000 people for the off-grid sector in Uganda. Three, I hope, interesting comparisons. Firstly, how does that workforce compare to the existing workforce in the off-grid? So how much does it have to grow by? Again, really difficult to estimate. There's very little data available. We spoke to the Uganda Solar Energy Association, which is a sort of trade body in Uganda for off-grid. They have 200 members, but no detailed records of member size. But they estimated that members generally between 5 and 30 employees, and that 15 was a useful average. But they also said there are 400 other companies in Uganda that are not our members, that are much smaller, but are still engaged in the sector, probably average around 5 employees per unit. So using those figures, we came to a sort of workforce currently in Uganda on the off-grid sector of about 5,000 people. In other words, you'd need to see a doubling or a tripling of that workforce almost immediately in order to be able to hit the 2030 targets that are in these various Ugandan national strategies. So that's one interesting comparison. I think the second is maybe how does that stack up against the formal grid sector? I mean, how many people are employed there? Again, really difficult to estimate from the published figures we can get for Umeme, which is the national utility and the biggest employee, but also rural electrification sector and some of the main sort of generation, transmission and distribution companies. We estimated that the formal electricity sector employs roughly 3,000 people. So that means that already the off-grid sector employs almost twice as much at 5,000 and will eventually employ somewhere between 3 and 5 times as many people as the formal sector. So it's substantive in that sense. And then maybe a third comparison is of course, to Uganda's total employment figures. And it has Uganda has a workforce of about 10 million people that are in some form of paid employment, and another 6 million people who are in subsistence agriculture. So, in that context, of course, the direct jobs in the off-grid sector looks pretty small. But some things to remember here: that the 9,000 to 16,500 jobs figure for the off-grid sector only relates to direct jobs. So those are the ones that are actually involved in the supply of electricity. It doesn't include associated indirect or productive use jobs or induced jobs. And these will increase the overall employment. By how much is subject to quite a lot of debate, and maybe that's something we can talk about in a minute, but certainly will make those figures substantially larger. We didn't include clean cooking in this analysis, and if there is eventually a push in Uganda to move towards electrification for clean cooking, that could make a substantial difference to those figures again. And then finally, I guess there is to say, it might be a small number of jobs, 9,000 to 16,500, but as I said at the beginning, without those jobs, Uganda doesn't electrify. So they're absolutely critical jobs, and they make a big impact on what other people can go forward then and do. So just 2 final thoughts, and then I'll finish. Estimates vary. One thought I think is about churn in the sector. So estimates vary, but about 30 to 50% of the jobs in off-grid sector in Uganda are informal. For example, they're sales agents for solar home systems. They're paid through commission on sales rather than getting a wage. The working conditions are not great. The earnings are not great. And anecdotal evidence suggests that the turnover amongst that workforce is quite high. And that ties in with findings in other countries. So in Kenya and Nigeria, for example, we're saying sort of typical retention times in the off-grid sector of about 30 to 35 months for formal jobs, but as little as 9 to 10 months for informal jobs. And if we see that in Uganda, which it looks like to be the case, that essentially means that around 50% of the workforce has to be replaced every year in order to just keep going. And that's obviously a huge cost in terms of training and recruitment, and points to something else needing to happen in order to make those jobs more like decent work and sort of viable in the first place. And then my last point to note, I guess, was that it should be noted that women are underrepresented in the grid sector. Of the institutions and the companies we interviewed, the workforce on average was about 30% female, but most of that was in unskilled or very low-skilled jobs. Women continue to face barriers to entry, cultural, social norms, limited access to finance, financial literacy, and also some very practical things like access to a motorcycle, which is often needed to distribute systems in rural areas. So there is a need for training and employment programs that specifically sort of target women and women's needs. And if we can be successful in doing that, there's also a potential advantage of securing a workforce that's more likely to want to stay in the rural areas and more likely to stay in those jobs. GIZ is one example of an organisation that's already mandating that 30% of all of its technical training in the area has to be for females. But a couple of thoughts to just finish with.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. I think it was a very interesting study on a number of levels. If we go beyond just the numbers, I think you can see the huge multiplier effect that you have of employment, of good employment in this sector. I think that particularly when you look at the productive use aspects, you're moving further away from the actual provision of the companies that we're looking to support, you see a much larger effect. And I think this brings me very nicely to the work that Christine, you've been doing from the Power for All. For the audience, Christine is the CEO of Power for All. She's been working for many years on general energy sector, but you've also done a lot of very interesting work in terms of the jobs and the skills agenda. So we'd love to hear from you about some of the work you've been doing, and maybe if you have a chance also to comment on what Simon has said, and we'll come back with more questions. But yeah. Christine, please, your views.
Perfect. Well, hi everybody. Yes, Christina Skirka, founder and CEO of Power for All. And I have to say, so I've actually spent over 20 years in the energy industry, many years being the single woman in the room. So I have to say this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, especially when we do talk about gender. And just to start things off, I will say that in general, the renewable sector is better for women. You see more representation. About a third of the workforce in the renewable sector is female versus fossil fuels, which tends to be more like 20%. So that's already headed in the right direction. But I think I'd like to start off my remarks by just talking for a moment about COVID and sort of the effect that all jobs have been under, the stress that we've all experienced, and then talk about some of the resilience that we've actually seen in the decentralized renewable sector. So a little bit about Power for All first. So Power for All is a global campaign of over 300 partners around the world working with a sole focus to end energy poverty faster. And so that takes all sorts of different forms, but it is meant to be a campaign, and we do beat one drum, which is end energy poverty faster. And I think, one of the things that we kept running into in the early days of Power for All, when we were meeting with governments to really try to change the narrative around decentralized renewables, was some resistance saying, well, can you prove some development outcomes? Because I know what happens when I build a grid. And at that point we said, okay, well, we need to invest some time and money into not just curating evidence, because there was some evidence out there about the sector, but actually creating it. And so that led to our work empowering jobs. And before I get too deep into that, I will just say, obviously, all of us know the kind of numbers that have happened globally with COVID, right? So lots of people lost their jobs. Women disproportionately lost their jobs. Oftentimes, families were faced with a very difficult choice about, do both parents keep working, and do they outsource care in what could be a somewhat dangerous and unknown situation, or do we choose someone to stay at home? And more often than not, that was women. And overall during COVID, we saw something to the effect of, I believe it's around 4% of women. No, sorry, 4% of men lost their jobs and 5% of women lost their jobs. Now, if you look at that sort of holistically across the globe, those are massive numbers in the hundreds of millions. And it might seem like it's of not a huge discrepancy if it's 1%, but it really was significant. The other thing I would say is that according to GOGLA, the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association's recent report, they do every 6 months a report looking at the state of the off-grid industry, at least as it refers to rooftop solar and SHS or solar home systems. And according to their estimates, not only were we looking at losses of jobs and 100 million people pushed back into poverty, but we were also seeing that approximately 23 million people around the world lost their opportunity to access energy for the first time. Those estimates were based on reports from their member companies, et cetera, in terms of downscaling. So all of that is, reason for concern. And I think in addition, it's worth pointing out, because Simon was talking a little bit about the different kinds of employment, it's also worth actually pointing out that most of the losses suffered were in the informal sector. And that you got some sort of sense of that, of how flexible these jobs are, which in some ways can be a boon, and in other ways, like during COVID, was really a bane. So, but what I do want to say is that there are sustainable jobs, as you heard from Simon, available in this sector. And there's early evidence from our report, the 2021 job census, which we're working on now, that suggests that there's more resiliency in the decentralized renewable sector than many other sectors in the world. Again, I'm not going to cite specific numbers because we're in early stages of collection, but essentially what we've observed is, and GOGLA reinforced this on a panel we were on jobs yesterday, is that most of the companies, their employment that we trace in this sector, they basically at this point gotten back to pre-pandemic levels. So maybe not growth like we were anticipating, but at least holding steady. So that's actually really impressive and exciting, because there's not many industries that can say that. And based on the early feedback that we've gotten from our study, it's looking that in just even next year, we're going to see growth in this sector, and that we will probably reach beyond pre-pandemic levels of jobs by the end of 2022. So I think that's exciting, and especially when you piece that together with the type of energy it is. You've got resiliency in job creation, but you also have resiliency not just for local generation, but also decentralized renewables can do a lot for grids and weak grid environments to help sort of plug in those losses using battery and other technologies. So I think that's great news for everybody. And another thing that I want to take away from this, which I think echoes some of what Simon was saying, is that overall, we are seeing more jobs in this sector, in the renewable sector, in the decentralized renewable sector, than the traditional utilities alone. And having worked on the inside of utilities myself, I can say that even a decade ago, utilities were already fearing this sort of lack of young people wanting to be involved in their sector, and instead wanting to do things that they found exciting and good for the planet. Demonstrations of 100,000 people can't be wrong this last weekend. But really, we are able to attract in droves young people to this sector as long as we can get that sort of pipeline right. And I was on a panel yesterday where we were talking about the issues of what are we doing to sort of demystify the sector. I mean, there's a lot of jargon that goes into decentralized renewables. Even that as a name can be a little off-putting. But I actually think one of the things our sector needs to do is we need to mimic what the petroleum industry has done in terms of creating this pathway for young people to get involved. Recruiting people right out of college, doing classes in college, having partnerships with academics where people are getting exposed at a very young age, and that they grow up thinking that renewable energy is business as usual instead of a centralized fossil fuel power plant. So there's a ton of opportunity there, but I think, another one of the things I'd like to emphasize is just the inclusiveness of this sector, as well as the equity of this sector. And, we hear a lot about just transition transition, et cetera. But I think inclusion and equity are ways that we can measure and evaluate that in a much more specific way. So when it comes to discussions about inclusivity, again, some of these numbers that we've shared about maybe more women, even though we can do better, more women being involved, more opportunities for youth in terms of diversity of jobs. But from an equitable point of view, our findings may be different a little bit from what Simon found, but in general, the findings that we have say that the wages on average are better in this sector than many other sectors. In fact, most other sectors in the markets that we're looking at. So that's all important to note. And I guess, the last couple things I would say is that one of the great things about decentralized renewable energy, having worked in this sector for about a decade now, after doing more traditional energy efficiency and working with utilities and whatnot, is that so much of the orientation of the sector is to be close to the communities they serve. So whether we're talking rural or peri-urban areas, just by the nature of the design of the technology, we need people in those localities, whether it's servicing or sales, et cetera. But that itself, I think, is really promising, because as Simon said, those are definitely areas that tend to suffer many job losses and a lot of informal jobs. So the fact that that's already aligned is great. And I know we're going to connect back to productive use and maybe to pick up on some of the things that were said earlier. Supply chain has been an issue for everybody, and no doubt for this sector as well. So even though there's increasing conversations about developing this sector into local assembly and manufacturing, that's still not really happening yet. We're starting to see some of that movement in Kenya and Ethiopia and a few other countries. But in the meantime, most of this product is manufactured overseas. It's oftentimes a 3-month lag time from, inception and building to shipment and actually getting the product into people's hands. So anything we can do to shorten that timeline, I think is really useful, not just for job creation, but also for this ultimate end, which is to end energy poverty faster. On the supply chain side, this is again where decentralized renewables can make a big difference and build more resiliency into supply chains. If you take the example of agriculture, so in most of the countries that Simon and I have worked in, you're looking at situations where the vast majority of the population is employed in the agricultural sector. In most cases, it's 60 to 70% of the workforce. And so think about that. So maybe you've got a smallholder farmer, but because you don't have an adequate cold chain, because you haven't got decentralized renewables, throughout the system for productive use yet, any gains that you might be achieving with milling, say, on site for a farmer that's, maybe run by a solar system, or maybe it's connected to a solar mini grid, those gains will be lost because we don't have the ability to refrigerate the foods as they go along, the produce. And so then you're robbing people of jobs of reselling that produce, or using that produce to, make great food that people want to buy in restaurants. So you can see how there's a really virtuous ecosystem that's available to be created here. And I really congratulate both Denmark's efforts and Beyond the Grid and the Beyond the Grid for Africa Fund, specifically because it is forward-looking to see the development of this ecosystem just on the cusp and providing the kind of incentive and support that's necessary to really actualize that. So I think that suits my opening remarks section.
Right, no, thank you for that.
Yeah.
A lot of things to pick up on there. I think just to sort of give some perspective of what we're trying to do with the Beyond the Grid Fund on a couple of the points that you both raised. Now, I think the Danish funding that's come into this funding window, we're taking on some of the recommendations made by Oxford Policy Management, and we're working on designing a skills development program, taking into account a lot of the recommendations made, so hoping to work with local institutions, trying to work on the needs that have been assessed and are tailored very much to what companies want and need. So a big part of that will be talking to companies at an early stage and saying, look, what sort of skills deficits do you face? And this is not just for a sectoral perspective. What do you need? So we want to be needs driven. And more generally on gender, of course, we try to mainstream the gender agenda, if you will. So what the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa is trying to do is trying to work with companies. So we're supporting companies, we're working with the private sector. And look, I mean, many of these companies get it. Many of them realize actually that, the diversity and inclusiveness of the workforce is important for them, particularly in the sales area. We've seen a lot of companies which, for example, realize that women are very good at cultivating relationships. They can be more trustworthy, they build the trust in the communities, and they're great. But we also want to see more women in management. And we're looking at setting targets for having more women in management roles. We've seen, obviously, there are many very, very practical constraints around that. We're also looking at gender pay parity and getting companies to report on the differences between men and women there. So we've got a lot to take forward, we're trying to move forward with this agenda, and we hope to disseminate some of the findings that we have going forwards. So I'm also very cognizant of the fact that we have an audience. We are having a conversation here, but we also want to engage the audience here. If any of you have questions to the panel, please prepare them, and I'll come back to you in a moment. But if I could turn to you first of all, Simon, I think based on your research and you spoke to companies, you spoke to organizations, particularly in Uganda, what was your sense of the employers' attitudes towards seizing the youth employment opportunity? Are they willing to invest in skills development, or do they just see this as an additional cost?
Well, there's a couple of things to say there. In one sense, they've already seized it. Something between 80 and 90% of employees of those companies were defined as youth. They were young. Right. So it's seized in one sense, and one of the senses of why that is partly because it's flexible rural employment, but also the technology element seems to appeal more to young people. So that's there. But I think I still say those jobs are largely paid on commission. I have to say that from what we could find out, most of the actual technical installers were also young. So there are clearly some that are making it through to be trained up. But it's something like 1 in 20 employees is actually a technician, and the other 19 are sales or sort of backroom people. So I think there is still young people are coming into jobs largely because they don't have formal qualifications, and these jobs are available and they're relatively low skilled, but they're also falling out of them, as you can see from the churn. And that creates a bit of a chicken and egg situation for companies, because I think companies want to invest, but they see a very high turnover, so they see their investment disappearing out the door very quickly, so they don't invest, and then they get a high turnover. So there's something that's needed to sort of break that cycle, I think. And then, of course, just to say, there's a smaller and bigger company dynamic going on here as well. So larger companies, you do see maybe having training schemes or having people in as unpaid volunteers to start with to get them onto the ladder. Smaller companies find that much more difficult to do. They just don't have the investment to do it.
Let me just add a few things to that. So before starting Power for All, I worked for a company called D-Light. It's one of the sort of well-known companies in the space, kind of considered a first mover in solar home systems. And I remember when I first started, I went to one of the trainings in Africa, and in particular, we were in Kenya, and I mean that was the kind of company with large venture funds, not just grants and not just debt, but could really afford and train its own people, and that's what you tend to see. You see these companies that are some of the bigger ones in the space, maybe the top 5 to 10 companies, the Zolas, the Mcopas, that can really develop their own training program. I will say, what I observed was such enthusiasm in youth, but in addition, it's just a younger population, right? And so by nature of that, I think it speaks to what are the kind of training programs that work to adapt to that environment versus maybe, the stodgy things for old people like us that might attract us. But, there's reason to be bullish on the opportunity here. So the Rockefeller Foundation actually just did a bit of a modeling exercise as part of their launch of the new GAP platform. And in that, they estimated that by 2030, there could be 25 million jobs in this sector alone. Which is incredible. Now there's lots of pieces that have to go into that for support, but part of that support is getting training right. And I also don't think that it's just a corporate need. I think that, and many governments have various efforts around TVET, so technical and vocational training. They also have entities that are responsible for job and employment studies, and there's no reason that there shouldn't be standards set for what is a good and responsible way to train up this sector, because it benefits the public good of energy access as well.
Yeah, no, good points. I think what we'd like to do, taking forward our job creation and training module, is to try to address some of these needs. So this is very useful information for us. I think the distinction that you make between the larger companies and local, let's say more indigenous companies, is very salient, because we have in our funding windows we try to accommodate both. So we have a so-called direct to scale window, which is open for those larger multinational companies active in many markets, typically better capitalized. And we also have the launch to scale, which is smaller companies which don't have that wherewithal, and we'd like to support those companies and try and help them through their sort of growth phase, both through the funding that we provide, but also to support them in skills development. So hopefully we can take some of these ideas forward. Okay, so do we have any early volunteers for questions from the audience? Right, it's a gentleman here at the back, but if I can give you a microphone, I think, I think you'll get, and if you could tell us who you are and maybe to whom you'd like the question directed, or if it's a comment.
Thank you very much. I'm Mattia Vianello with Practical Action. My question is for Simon. Great presentation. Very interesting to hear those findings. But one comment is, it would be great to see this study and also the methodology, and to understand how that can be applied retrospectively also at programs around energy access. That could be a very potential tool to really advocate for programs, but also to understand what is really bringing. But my question is a bit more specific. You say that you looked also at productive uses of energy and how many jobs they are creating through, like, for example, agriculture, services with new access to energy. I was wondering to which detail you looked at, for example, how irrigation has been brought jobs differently from maybe processing, and did you find any particular thread in the agricultural sector which was particularly promising in terms of jobs? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mattia. In fact, just to be clear, what I was trying to say was we didn't look at productive use. We looked at just one of the 5 categories, and one of the reasons we didn't look at productive use is because it's extraordinarily difficult to get hold of the numbers, and I'm sure you will back me up on this, because Christina had the same problem with the Powering Jobs survey. The first thing is the sort of breadth of use that could potentially be put. Running from irrigation through to household appliances, for food processing, through to running small metal workshops or whatever. And the other thing is that a lot of those productive uses actually require quite substantial power supplies. And this is one of my bugbears, if you like, that I think the sector is being overburdened with expectations around productive use, particularly for household level of energy. There's an expectation that even a sort of small, simple solar home system will somehow have an economic benefit for a household. And it may do, but it's often going to be very marginal when you look at any serious studies. And I think we need to be thinking about sort of household electricity at 2 levels. There's a primary level, which is just about quality of living. We don't have that problem when we think about health or access to food, or access to water for that matter. But when it comes to electricity, for some reason, we put these added burdens on, which are not always productive or appropriate. And I think the productive use is a really interesting area, but I think it requires a lot more. Just just a couple of other things on that. I run another research program called the Applied Research Program into Energy and Economic Growth. It's an FCDO funded program where we commissioned quite a few academic studies looking at sort of productive use and the relationship between access to energy and economic growth. And when it comes, and it's always difficult to actually demonstrate that direct link. There are some interesting studies. There's one, for example, in Nepal, which historically looks at the growth of mini-grids and tries to look at whether or not there's a growth in enterprises in areas as a result. And one of the things you see there is that there is, over time, or very often it takes quite a few years for that productive use to actually kick in from electricity being provided, but also that actual amount of growth depends on so many other things. And one of the most obvious ones is how far away that particular location is from a roadhead, from a market, from other sort of basic supplies. So for me, productive growth is really interesting, but energy access is a binding constraint to it. Solving the energy problem alone is not sufficient, and it's always quite difficult to answer that question, how many productive use jobs come out of providing electricity, because there are so many other things that have to happen in order for that to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just from my own experience, just briefly, because we're running a pilot in Uganda called Utilities 2.0, where essentially the concept is by working together, centralized and decentralized sources of energy can actually accelerate this transition, right? That we can get faster access, we can increase demand and productive use, and we can improve the overall energy system performance. And so part of the test there is looking at productive use. And I absolutely get your point, Simon, and there's these ideas now circulating about this modern energy minimum and this effort to really push for equality of energy rather than equity. But equity, which is, there's a distinction there, which is it's the amount you can use right now that's right for you, as opposed to a standard of everybody needs the same amount of energy globally to have the same standard of living. And I think what's really informative about that is that those first connections are still incredibly critical to changing people's lives. And then what we've observed in Utilities 2.0 is people then need to learn how to use their energy. You don't just have a connection and figure it out. And so by supplementing the work that we're doing with an appliance financing project where we're bringing productive use of energy, both in milling and being able to get a refrigerator, et cetera, we are actually seeing an incredible number of small household-based businesses grow. And not just those businesses, but there's businesses growing up around this development that we didn't even anticipate. So I think there's a natural impulse sort of to head in that direction, but it's absolutely part of the training as well. So training, we're talking about globally sort of training jobs, but I think we also need to think about how do we teach people to build businesses, if that's what they want to do, off the backs of that first connection.
Absolutely, and I think what we found, for example, with the programs that have been supported in Zambia, there's been a lot of growth, particularly on the mini-grid sector, with micro businesses, very small businesses, refrigeration businesses, barbers and so forth, and there's a huge amount of opportunity there going forward, relatively small amounts of load. And I think there's also a huge opportunity with electric cooking. I think we've got a long way to go there. That adds more load as well. And whilst it's sort of counterintuitive for folks who've been working with energy efficiency and getting people to use less energy over the years, I think we're looking at the opposite rather, trying to get people to use electricity, and also, let's face it, we want to displace charcoal. We want to displace some of the traditional as a productive use element also. Okay, do we have any more questions from the audience? I think the gentleman in the middle, please.
It's okay?
Yes, we can hear you, sir. Please.
Thank you. Sorry. My name is Amadou Gaye. I'm professor at University Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar. So my question is about the sustainability of those jobs. You talk about mainly, I can say green jobs, but somehow, as you know, how it is working in Africa, you can have those very nice jobs at local level in villages, run by young people or women, etc. And something happens, a big project, a grid coming and giving power, for the people. So how really can we, did you think about that? The sustainability of taking into account the possibility of having big investment for companies, of course.
Yeah, I didn't understand your question so well, but I can make a comment on the sustainability. You're asking about sustainability of jobs. What the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa is trying to do really is to support businesses. And we want businesses to, we're not supporting projects, we're not supporting specific initiatives, we're supporting businesses to become financially sustainable. We support them over a period of four years, and we essentially invest in them so that they would invest in the infrastructure that they need. And we hope that once a company, we want them to go up country, we want them to work in the rural areas, and once they've invested in the infrastructure there, be it physical infrastructure, be it human capital, then they will see a need to stay, and they will try and build up the sort of the customer base in those areas that will allow them to continue to sort of employ people. But I don't know if what sort of comments.
I think the point the gentleman was making also was that what happens when the grid eventually extends out and you've created a lot of jobs that are around off-grid activity, so are those jobs sustainable? And I think, in the case of the Uganda study, the strategies that exist in Uganda for universal access at the moment do sort of stop with the grid not covering the whole of the country. They stop with a certain proportion of the country still having off-grid supplies of one sort or another. There's a big ambition that those will eventually sort of move towards mini-grids and away from just solar home systems so that you can take bigger loads. But the vision is not in the foreseeable future, is not of everybody connected to the grid. So I think there is potential for those jobs, and we were looking out till 2030, so definitely to 2030 there's a lot of potential for those jobs to be sustained. Beyond that, probably by another 10 or 15 years at least. Going back to Christina's point, if in that period you can start increasing loads, if you can go beyond just very basic solar home systems so that people have the opportunity for productive use, then maybe those jobs can start to be converted into promotion of productive use applications rather than just household lights. And then by the time the grid arrives, you're in a situation to really exploit the grid. So I think there are plenty of opportunities to make those jobs sustainable, but it does require a little bit of forethought.
Yeah, and I guess I would say too, it's an excellent question, but I don't know, it's very rare these days where you see a company that's just solar home systems or just tier 1 lighting. Almost every company has an array of products and services, and now we have so many efficient appliances that work in either a wake grid environment or an off-grid environment that companies constantly need to have that workforce. And I will say, again, just going back to the resiliency of the sector, sure, there's been some job losses and sure, we've lost some companies, but overall, this is really a very comparatively sustainable sector. It's proving out, again, an early look at data. So it's a great question, but, at this point, especially with some of the commitments being talked about here, we're going to need everybody we have in the renewables energy sector, whether it's decentralized or centralized. So hopefully those will be sustainable. We can actually prevent global warming.
Let's hope so. Yes. Sorry, the gentleman behind you, and then sorry.
Yeah,
thank you.
My name is Ali from Ghana. I just want to find out from your organization, what are your organization trying to do to help a lot of women to enter into agriculture once they are true and wealthy? I want to know what your organization is trying to do to help them grow in the agriculture sector as well as energy.
Okay, so we don't have a specific focus on agriculture, but we do have a range of financial incentives that we pay on a results-based financing basis, so based on outcomes. And part of that includes a multiplier effect for productive use elements. So for example, if you were to add some, if the company that's bidding into our competition is able to add a number of, let's say, solar irrigation pumps or milling equipment, they can get a multiplier on the financial incentive. So they're incentivized to contribute to those. So there are mechanisms in in the funding and disbursement regime for that. And thank you, gentlemen here, for being so patient. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Randall-Boggess from the University of Sheffield. And I also especially appreciate that last question, actually, because I'm working in agrivoltaics in East Africa, so very much energy and agriculture combined. It's a bit of a niche question, but I was wondering what's in place sorry, I'm going to... It's a bit of a niche question, but I'm wondering what's in place to also support research and innovation and those kind of skills to innovate the energy sector in Africa as well. Thank you.
Well, actually, it could be a question that Simon could think about. But we don't do that. We're very much focused on trying to get energy access. We try to disseminate what we learn. We have an undertaking to do that. But beyond that, we don't have research and innovation. We tend to promote proven technologies. Because we really focused on the outcomes. But I guess maybe my fellow panelists are aware. I know that there are a lot of innovation funds out there, Innovate UK and others here, but also the European Union has a range of innovation products as well. But I don't know if you want to comment on that, Simon.
I mean, the program that I work on is a research program primarily looking at grid infrastructure and how that can interact in terms of promoting energy access and growth. But there's the T program, FCDO, the Total Energy Access Program, which has just had another 125 million, I think we agreed, that's been announced just last week for that, and that has a research element, and that is very much off-grid sector. So that's a good one to focus on from the UK perspective.
Yeah, but Google it. There are so many challenge funds and so many, the Earthshot Prize. There's tons of things out there that are constantly about evolution, and I think even more than technology, it's evolution in business model. And I think that's always been one of the nuts to crack for this sector, and because this sector was based on working with existing energy budgets of poor people. And so instead of providing products and services that would provide a connection that was beyond their existing budget for, say, kerosene or diesel, it was meant to work with that, right? And so then, now we look at next innovations around productive use, appliance financing, et cetera. I mean, a lot of what needs to be done is innovation in business model. But yeah, there's tons of funds out there that are forcing us to look at how to innovate and be a better sector.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to our panelists for your insights. Very interesting. Please do stay in touch with us. We have a website. We are growing as a program. We're hoping to announce a number of new initiatives. We're hoping to announce new countries. So please do watch this space. And thank you once again all for your attention.